Okay, let's face it, if you live in NSW, I mean, especially Sydney, trying to find an affordable place to live, it just feels like a constant uphill battle, doesn't it?
It really does.
The numbers, they really tell the story. Back in, what, early 2020, the median house price in Sydney was already like 8.6 times the median income. Pretty hefty.
Mm.
Fast forward just 4 years, March 2024, and that's jumped to 9.5.
Wow.
Yeah. And across the rest of NSW, it's a similar story, a climb from 6.7 up to 8.7.
Right.
And saving that deposit, forget it being quick. We're talking over 12 and a half years in Sydney.
12 and a half years.
And still like 11 and a half years elsewhere in the state. That's huge.
It's a massive chunk of time.
And then you look at how much of your actual paycheck just vanishes into mortgage payments or rent around here compared to other places.
Yeah.
It's a seriously tough situation many of you are facing right now.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, the main solution that policymakers are sort of putting forward right now is to just ramp up housing supply
Right.
significantly. The underlying idea is pretty simple, really.
Mm.
If we build more homes, eventually prices should become, more manageable.
Yeah, it seems like basic supply and demand, but I mean, if it were really that easy, wouldn't we have solved this already?
That's the question, isn't it?
So for this deep dive, we're going to dig a bit deeper than that surface level idea. We're taking a really close look at the economics of housing supply, what the actual research tells us,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to get past some of the common assumptions to understand what's truly going on, and importantly for you listening, what could realistically make a difference.
Exactly.
Because it's clearly not just about putting up more buildings. It feels like a much more intricate picture.
Precisely. And to help us navigate this, we're drawing on a really valuable paper. It was published just this August 2024.
Okay.
It's titled The Economics of Housing Supply, Key Concepts and Issues by Rachel Ong, V4J, and Chris Leishman.
Right.
And what makes this paper particularly useful, I think, is its reliance on peer-reviewed research.
So properly checked out by other experts.
Exactly. That means the findings have been, rigorously looked at by others in the field, which gives us a much more reliable base for our discussion today.
Okay, good. So let's unpack this. One of the first things the paper looks at is just how much new housing supply actually, responds when demand changes.
Right.
The basic theory is if more people want to buy or rent, prices go up, and that should make developers keen to build more, yeah?
That's the core principle, absolutely. And to measure this reaction, economists use a concept called elasticity of supply.
Elasticity, okay.
Yeah. And when we talk about housing, this elasticity usually refers specifically to new housing supply.
Got it.
Basically, it tells us the percentage change in the supply of new homes for every, say, 1% change in price.
Okay, so what does that elasticity number actually mean in practical terms, like for someone trying to find a home?
Well, okay, if the elasticity value is greater than 1, we call that elastic. It means a 1% price increase leads to a more than 1% increase in housing supply. So a really responsive market.
Right, quick reaction.
Exactly. On the other hand, if the elasticity is less than 1 that's inelastic, a 1% price rise only triggers a smaller than 1% increase in supply. Things are slower to respond.
Less reactive.
Precisely. And if it's exactly 1, well, supply changes by the same percentage as the price.
Okay. And where does Australia sit in all this? Are we, quick off the mark building more when prices climb?
Generally, Australia's elasticity for new housing supply is estimated somewhere around 0.5.
So inelastic, less
Right.
than 1.
Yes, inelastic. The paper notes that compared to other developed OECD nations, this kind of puts us in the middle, maybe similar to New Zealand.
Okay.
What's interesting, though, is that countries like the U.S. and Sweden, they're seen as much more responsive, more elastic.
Right.
While places like the UK and the Netherlands tend to have even lower elasticity than we do, they're less responsive again.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting for you listening, because it's not just one number for the whole country, is it?
No, definitely not.
How quickly supply reacts seems to change quite a bit depending on where in Australia you're actually looking.
Precisely. Housing markets aren't uniform. They're broken down into different segments, so you've got different cities, obviously.
Mhm.
And then even within those cities, you have what economists call spatial submarkets. Think about how different the housing market is in, say, Penrith compared to Bondi.
Totally different worlds, even though they're both in Sydney.
Exactly. And then you also have sectoral submarkets. So looking at houses versus apartments separately, because they often behave quite differently in terms of supply.
Right.
And the responsiveness, that elasticity number, can vary quite a lot across all these different submarkets.
Can you give us a specific example, maybe for NSW?
Yeah, Sydney is a perfect case study. The paper points out that between 1991 and 2005, Sydney's estimated housing supply elasticity was around 0.33.
Okay, so already lower than that national average of 0.5 you mentioned.
Correct. And more recent estimates actually put it even lower, somewhere in the 0.20 to 0.26 range, so
Mm.
even less responsive. And if you drill down further, the inner areas of Sydney, they have an even lower elasticity, around 0.26, compared to the outer suburbs,
Yeah.
which are up around 0.43.
That makes sense, I guess. Land is just scarcer and way more expensive in the inner city.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the intuition. So even if prices jump significantly in inner Sydney, you don't necessarily see a big flood of new houses hitting the market quickly. It's just harder to make it happen there.
So the financial incentive might be strong, but the physical and economic hurdles in those inner areas are just really high.
That's a good way to put it. And this really highlights why thinking about these spatial submarkets is so important. High supply responsiveness in one area, maybe Paramount out west,
Yeah.
doesn't automatically translate into lower prices in a completely different submarket, like the eastern suburbs, where land is much more constrained and costly.
Hmm.
The markets are somewhat separate.
Okay. And it's not just about where you are in the city, right? The type of housing matters too.
Absolutely. Apartments, or units, generally tend to have a higher supply elasticity than detached houses.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, in Sydney, for example, the elasticity for apartments has been estimated around zero point 0.8, much closer to elastic,
Yeah, much higher.
while for houses, it's only about zero point 0.2. Very inelastic.
Okay.
It could be because it's often, physically easier or more feasible to build higher density apartment buildings on available sites. The development processes might be different too.
Right.
And the paper also notes a couple of other things. That elasticity number can shift depending on whether you're measuring, say, building approvals versus actual completions
Yeah.
or the total housing stock.
Okay.
And also, supply generally becomes a bit more responsive over longer time periods. It takes time to react.
Okay, so already this picture is way more complex than just build more houses. Now, the paper also raises a really critical point about how we even define housing supply in these discussions.
Yes, this is a really important distinction for you to get your head around. When policymakers talk about increasing housing supply, they almost always seem to focus on new housing supply.
Right, the brand new builds.
Exactly. New houses, new apartments being constructed. But the paper rightly points out that this is, well, a pretty limited way of thinking about it.
Why is that?
Because the vast, vast majority of homes actually available on the market at any point in time come from the existing housing stock.
Ah, okay. All the homes that were built years and decades ago.
Precisely. All those homes already standing.
That makes perfect sense when you pause and think about it. I mean, the number of existing homes must completely dwarf the number of new ones added each year.
It does. And the paper illustrates this by looking at two different ways supply is measured. One is a stock measure, I think, the number of dwellings for every 1,000 people in the population.
Oh, well.
On that metric, Australia actually has one of the lowest ratios among developed OECD countries.
Yeah.
Fewer homes per person overall.
Really? Okay.
But then if you look at a flow measure, like the number of new homes completed each year,
Okay.
as a percentage of the total housing stock we already have.
Right, the rate of addition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On that flow measure, Australia has actually been above the OECD average at certain times.
Huh. So wait. We might feel like we're not building enough new homes overall, but compared to the size of our existing stock, our rate of new building hasn't always been that low.
That's a key insight for you, yes. While there might have been periods where new construction hasn't kept pace with population growth, there have also been times when our flow of new homes, relative to what exists, has been quite decent by international standards.
Interesting.
And this suggests that the housing affordability challenges you might be facing aren't necessarily just about the pace of new construction, the flow. It might also be about how effectively we're using the enormous stock of homes that already exist.
That's a really interesting angle. Makes you think about, vacant properties, underoccupied homes, people perhaps living in houses much bigger than they need.
All of those things, the utilization of the existing stock.
Okay. Let's switch gears slightly then. Let's talk about what actually influences the supply of those new homes. The paper breaks it down into 3 interconnected markets, right? Land, construction, and the housing market itself.
That's right, they all interact.
And within this, the planning system council rules, zoning often gets singled out as a potential roadblock.
It certainly does. Planning systems are frequently criticized, aren't they, for being too complex, too slow, maybe too rigid,
Yeah.
which can slow down the ability to get new homes built when and where they're needed.
So the common ideas for fixing it are things like streamlining rules, cutting red tape, allowing more density.
Exactly. Making planning rules more consistent across different levels of government, maybe easing restrictions on land use, allowing for more density that's called upzoning, and just generally speeding up the assessment process for development applications.
And there's this specific economic theory, isn't there, that these planning rules act almost like a hidden tax.
That's the regulatory tax or zoning tax theory. You hear that a lot.
Yeah.
Economists like Glazer and Yurko have written about it. The basic argument is that these regulations limit the supply of land that can be developed, and that creates a big gap between the final price buyers pay for a new home and the actual, basic cost of building it, plus a normal profit.
Pushing prices up artificially.
That's the theory. And some studies here in Australia have tried to estimate this effect, suggesting that a fair chunk of the higher housing prices in Sydney, compared to, say, Melbourne or Brisbane, could be put down to these planning restrictions.
But the paper also points out that this isn't like universally accepted. There are counter arguments.
Absolutely. It's quite debated. A growing number of peer-reviewed studies, including several done here in Australia, actually question whether planning regulations are really the main driver of high land prices.
Oh, okay. What are the criticisms?
Well, one key criticism is about the theory itself. The idea that you can easily combine marginal bits of land, it doesn't always reflect how land markets actually work in practice. It's often not that simple.
Right.
And these alternative views also emphasize that studies focusing only on the zoning tax often don't fully account for other really important factors that push up property prices.
Like what?
Things like interest rates on mortgages, which have been historically low until recently, people's expectations about future price growth, various taxes involved in property, and just, the simple desirability and amenity of a particular location, good schools, parks, transport.
All those things that make people want to live somewhere.
Exactly. Even some of the economists who first proposed the zoning tax idea admit it's actually really hard to perfectly separate the impact of regulations from all these other powerful market forces.
Okay.
Plus, you have to remember, planning systems are very localized. What happens in one council area can be very different from the next. And maybe surprisingly, there's actually a lack of robust, peer-reviewed Australian studies that have specifically used this zoning tax methodology to reach firm conclusions.
And here's something the paper mentions that really made me pause, something that might surprise you listening. Even in places where the planning rules do allow for a lot more housing to be built,
The zone capacity.
right, that potential often doesn't actually get used.
Exactly. Zone capacity is basically the number of extra homes that could legally be built under the current planning rules in an area.
Okay.
But a study in Brisbane, for instance, found that only a tiny percentage, like 2% over 5 years of the available zone capacity was actually developed. And over 20 years, almost 80% remained undeveloped.
Wow. So the planning rules weren't the bottleneck there.
It strongly suggests they weren't the main barrier in those cases. It raises the possibility that, developers might choose to delay projects for their own strategic or financial reasons, even when they have planning permission or could easily get it.
Which leads us nicely into the next piece of this puzzle, how developers and landowners actually behave. It's not always that perfect, rational economic model, is it?
That's right. We have to factor in the human element. Behavioral economics comes into play here.
Okay.
For landowners, the paper makes a distinction between those who are actively looking to develop or sell and those who might be more passive, maybe holding land for other reasons.
Like sentimental value.
That too, yeah. They mention psychic income, the non-financial benefit of just owning a piece of land, perhaps family history attached to it.
Right?
And here's a counterintuitive bit. Market uncertainty, like rapidly rising prices, can actually slow down the supply of land coming onto the market.
How does that work? Why would rising prices slow things down?
It's about something called the real option value of the land.
Okay.
Think of it like this. If prices are shooting up, a landowner might think, if I wait a bit longer, I might get an even higher price. So they hold off selling or developing.
Ah, the option to wait is valuable in itself.
Exactly. It's like having the option, but not the obligation, to sell or develop later,
Hmm.
potentially at a better price.
Yeah.
Conversely, if the market looked like it might cool off, they might be more motivated to act sooner.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the developers? How do their decisions shape the flow of new homes?
Well, developers often buy land well ahead of time, sometimes years before they plan to build. They do this to ensure they have a continuous pipeline of projects. This is often called land banking.
Right, I've heard that term. Is it a big factor?
Well, it's debated. We don't actually have a clear picture of how widespread, deliberate, strategic land banking is in Australia. Although one study in Queensland did find evidence of developers holding large land banks, but interestingly, found no clear link between the amount of zoned land available and the actual rate of new supply coming through.
So holding land didn't necessarily mean building was imminent.
Not necessarily in that case, no. The paper also points out something practical. Developers often find it easier and quicker to adjust the asking prices for the homes they are building, rather than changing their actual construction schedules.
Because building takes time, planning, contracts.
Exactly.
Right.
Construction projects are complex, they have long lead times. It's harder to just flick a switch and build faster or slower. Adjusting the price is more immediate.
Okay.
And there's another interesting dynamic. Intense competition among developers just to buy the land in the first place can sometimes lead to slower overall build rates later on.
How?
Because if they've had to bid really high to secure the land, they might then need prices in the housing market to keep rising steadily just to achieve their target profit margin. So they might meter out the supply rather than flood the market.
Right, to maintain price levels after paying so much for the land.
Potentially, yes. It's complex.
Okay. And finally, the paper touches on something really fundamental: the actual costs of development and getting the finance. It stands to reason that if it's super expensive or hard to get funding, fewer new homes will get built.
Absolutely crucial. High costs definitely reduce supply responsiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And a whole range of things feed into these costs.
Like what?
Things like the availability or shortage of skilled construction workers, the level of unionization in the industry, government regulations like new energy efficiency standards, which might add costs.
Mm-hmm.
The location building in remote areas is obviously more expensive, the type of construction technology used, even the weather and the physical challenges of the land itself, the topography.
Lots of factors.
Lots of factors. And then there's finance. Banks and other lenders often view development projects as inherently quite risky
Why is that?
because of things like potential blowouts in construction costs, unexpected delays, changes in interest rates during the project, all these uncertainties.
Right.
This can make it harder, especially for smaller, less established developers, to get the loans they need to get projects off the ground. Access to finance is a big constraint.
Okay. So bringing this all together for you listening, what are the key takeaways here? And what does this really mean for tackling housing affordability? Because it's clearly not as simple as just saying build more houses and expecting prices to magically fall.
You've really hit the nail on the head there. While Basic Economics 101 tells us that increasing supply should, all else being equal, lead to lower prices.
Yeah, the ceteris paribus condition.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That all else being equal condition almost never truly holds in real-world housing markets. They're incredibly dynamic. The really crucial factor is how housing demand interacts with supply. Demand is driven by so many things: population growth, migration, investment activity, interest rates, people wanting to live in desirable locations.
And that demand can just soak up any new supply.
It can often counteract or at least blunt the impact of increases in supply, especially in the short to medium term. We also just need to remember that producing housing is a much more complex, lengthy, and lumpy process than producing, say, widgets in a factory.
Yeah, definitely.
And all those complexities we've just walked through, the way supply responds differently in different places and for different dwelling types.
The inelasticity, especially in places like inner Sydney.
Right. The ongoing debates about how much planning rules really constrain things versus other factors.
The developer and landowner behavior, the land banking, the option value.
And the very real challenges of development costs and finance. They all play a really significant role in why this is such a persistent and difficult problem to solve.
So the crucial insight here for you might be that while the narrative is often just build more, the problem might actually be more nuanced. It could be partly about how we're using the homes we already have.
Yes, the existing stock utilization.
And also the fact that simply wanting more housing in a specific desirable area doesn't easily or quickly translate into more actual houses being built right there because of all these constraints we've discussed.
Exactly right. And when we think about how new supply affects affordability, we really need to consider both the short run and the long run.
Okay.
In the short run, a few new developments coming online might not be enough to immediately satisfy all the pent-up demand and significantly stop prices from rising, especially in high-demand areas.
Right.
The bigger, longer-term impact on affordability comes as the total stock of homes gradually increases over many years.
But how much do we need? Is there a magic number? Well, that's the tricky part. There's actually not a lot of strong, conclusive Australian research that tells us exactly how much of a supply increase we need, sustained over time, to achieve a specific reduction in prices or rents. There was a major review in the UK, the Barker Review, some years ago. It suggested that very large, sustained increases in building rates way above historical levels would be needed over many, many years just to achieve even moderate reductions in the rate of price growth.
So, huge effort for maybe modest price impact,
Yeah.
and only long-term.
That was the suggestion there, yes. And while one Australian study did find a statistical link that a 1% increase in the number of dwellings seemed to correlate with a 2.5% decrease in housing costs.
Okay, that sounds promising.
It does. But the researchers themselves cautioned that their findings might actually reveal more about how prices influence the quantity of housing built the supply response we talked about earlier, rather than definitively proving that increasing quantity drives down prices by that much. The causality is hard to pin down.
Right, so it's not a simple cause and effect lever. It appears not to be quite that straightforward, no.
Okay. So wrapping this up then, what are the main things policymakers should really keep front of mind as they try to tackle this affordability crisis for you, the listener?
Well, the paper offers a few key reflections, I think. First, yes, increasing the overall supply of homes is still an important part of the puzzle. Nobody's really denying that.
Right.
But crucially, policies need to consider the entire complex process of creating new housing land, construction, finance, developer behavior, not just focus narrowly on reforming planning rules as if that's the only lever.
A broader view is needed.
Definitely. Second, because housing markets are so segmented geographically and by dwelling type, a single one-size-fits-all national or even statewide policy is unlikely to be very effective. Policies probably need to be more localized and sector-specific.
Tailored approaches.
Yes. Third, the impact of building more new homes on overall affordability is likely to be gradual and play out over the long term.
So no quick fixes from supply alone.
Probably not significant ones, no. Which means we also need other policies to help people, particularly those on lower incomes, afford housing right now in the short term. Supply increases won't solve their immediate problems.
Okay.
And finally, and this links back to that stock versus flow point, policies shouldn't just be about new construction. We also need to think much more seriously about how to make better use of and facilitate movement within our massive existing housing stock.
Right. Like those ideas around utilization.
Exactly. Thinking about things like incentives or barriers to downsizing for older households, the impact of transaction taxes, like stamp duty on people's willingness or ability to move to housing that better suits their needs. That whole side of the equation needs attention too.
Okay. So here's something for you to think about as we finish up. Given all these complexities we've explored today, the fact that supply often doesn't respond quickly, especially where it's needed most, the debates about planning versus other factors, the strategic behavior of developers and landowners, and the huge role of the homes we already have, is the current, very strong policy focus on simply building more new homes that's the most effective path forward? Or do we perhaps need a more nuanced, a more multifaceted approach? One that seriously tackles how we use our existing housing stock, maybe looks more closely at demand-side factors as well, alongside efforts to streamline supply. It's definitely something worth pondering as you navigate your own housing journey.